I'm going to abuse my position as chair very briefly and give you a little bit of an introduction to the Marks Memorial Library. Unfortunately, obviously, we can't be there this evening in our lovely historic building, but I do have a virtual background that you can see behind me. For those of you who don't know much about who we are a library, archive and education charity founded in 1933 in response to the rise of fascism in Europe, and also 50 years after Karl Marx died. So we've got a wonderful history of collecting a unique library, an archive collection on Marxism and the history of socialism on our 3-storey beautiful building on Clerkenwell Green. And from the outset, a key part of our work has always been education. We were founded as a workers' school. So we run online courses, lectures, book launches, exhibitions. We used to run school workshops. We hope to resume those shortly, and much, much more. So I do recommend you take a look at our website to see what activities we've got on at the moment. We're also a membership library, so do, if you're not already a member, join for just £25 a year, and you get a free subscription to our annual journal, Theory and Struggle, produced by Liverpool University Press. Now, we are particularly delighted to be hosting this event this evening because our building is crammed full of Marxist feminist history, from names probably lots of you would have heard of already, like Claudia Jones, founder of the Notting Hill Carnival and West Indian Gazette. We hold correspondence of hers from visits to the Soviet Union. We have some papers on Eleanor Marx and a wonderful poster in Pride of Place on our staircase, the trade unionist translator and editor. And we also have a beautiful statue of Sylvia Pankhurst in our reading room, which we're really hoping a full-size one gets erected just outside our building on Clerkenwell Green. We've got lots and lots of publications that Sylvia wrote for, including The Call, The Workers' Dreadnought, etc. And that's just a few of the big names. Of course, we also have lots of material on the multitude of working women who played a critical role in our movement over the decades, from the women who sparked the 1917 Russian Revolution to the nurses who volunteered in battlefield hospitals during the Spanish Civil War, and the print workers who locked horns with the Murdoch Empire much later in the 20th century. This book, Women in Class, which is in its 4th edition, published this year by Manifesto Press and the Communist Party, highlights the importance of re-examining the origins, history and present manifestation of women's oppression. So that's what we aim to do today in about 45 minutes. So I think that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over initially to Professor Mary Davis, who's author of Women in Class, which was first published in 1990. She's also secretary of the library, tutor and author, and much, much more. So we're going to hand over to Mary first. I'm just going to just get rid of my video as well.
Sorry about this, hang on, I just lost what I'm looking for. Okay, I've got it. Right. Very modestly, I have to say that this book is a step towards a Marxist feminist analysis of women's oppression. And I say a step towards because this is an area which I think has been, well, not shamefully, but anyway, pitifully under-researched. So I think it's essential to extend a Marxist analysis to what I consider to be a neglected area, and in so doing to examine and critique rival theories, of which there are many. And actually, and this hopefully will help to underpin our policy and practice, because I think that's what Marxism is about. It's not just a theory, it is also a practice. I'm amazed really to say that it's now more necessary to have an analysis of women's oppression since the first edition of this book was published in 1990. I mean, it's not just revised, it's a complete rewrite, because who could have predicted then that we would actually have to define what a woman is, an adult human female? I mean, what we are really faced with is new definitions of what a woman is. It's a cis woman, or it's a woman with an X. And the spelling of woman with an X is meant to show the inclusion of trans, non-binary, and all other marginalised genders. And that this spelling, and I quote some of the people who use it, is to separate ourselves from exclusionary feminisms. Well, this is a very strange era that we are in. It's quite true that some people have argued that women have made such great progress in the 21st century that we really don't know whether we still need to debate, to continue to debate on the issue of women's equality. And of course, the argument runs compared to previous centuries when women were the property of men and had no rights at all. It's clear now that women's status has improved, and I agree, it has juridically improved. But apart from the right to vote and the right to own property, equality for women as it now exists is based really by, I consider, a sort of unseen process of co-option. It's really based on the success of a favoured few, and for working class women, I think very little has changed. So despite the fact that women now account for over half the workforce in the UK, job segregation, precarious work, the gender pay gap, all persist, and this is underpinned by the myth of the family wage paid to the male breadwinner, even though if he doesn't exist, and compounded by a woeful lack of affordable childcare. And austerity politics, having undermined public services, has led to the feminisation of poverty. Again, something I can't go into, but we need to take note of this. And in the home, these figures actually are incorrect now. I was going to say 1 in 10 women experience domestic violence, and 1 in 4 will experience that type of abuse sometime in their lifetime. But this, of course, has increased exponentially during lockdown. So the figure that I had before all this was that an incidence of domestic violence takes place in Britain every 6 to 20 seconds. I'm sure that's much more now. So whilst some of these issues affect all women, their impact is much more severe and disproportionate for working class women. Thus, in capitalist society, the essential contradiction between women's role in social production and their role in the private realm of domestic reproduction remains unchanged. And this is really the essence of the argument. But this isn't the starting point. It's my starting point, but this isn't the starting point for 21st century so-called modern feminism and or of modern identity politics. The first lot get it wrong, and the second lot, i.e. the identity politics lot, actually eviscerate women anyway. So we know that the word feminism has penetrated the mainstream vernacular massively, actually, but its theoretical framework doesn't even attempt to analyse women's oppression at all. Instead, we're faced with two popular accepted forms of feminism, corporate feminism and choice feminism, and both of them operate very comfortably indeed within capitalism and have thus penetrated mainstream ideology. But they're founded on the presumption of individualistic self-help and are as such relevant only to the few who can function effectively within the capitalist system, the glass ceiling feminists, and I think we have to go past that. Well, Marx is my starting point for a new grand narrative. We haven't, in the early years of the second wave women's movement, there were all sorts of grand narratives attempting to theorise women's oppression and understand it. But we haven't got a women's movement at the moment, and hopefully we will get one, and there are signs that it's burgeoning. But there is an absence of a grand narrative, so Marx is my starting point for a new grand narrative. And this is where I hope this is the book makes a contribution, but as I say, it's certainly not a finished product. Historical materialism starts from the notion that people have to eat before they can think. In other words, human consciousness doesn't exist. Thought doesn't exist before material reality. That in order to eat, men and women, mankind, womankind has to produce, and in in doing that, they have to enter into, and I'm paraphrasing Marx's critique of political economy, they have to enter into social production, in which they have to then enter into definite relations of production, and then to quote Marx, that are indispensable and independent of their will. These definite relations are class relations, and all forms of society are forms of class society, and capitalism, of course, is its exemplar. Now, in this respect, I don't, obviously can't go into class and class definition, but I do reject the view that I've seen coming quite a lot these days, that women are a biological sex class. That I don't agree with. It's important to understand, and this is what Women in Class attempts to do, and I say it's only a first attempt in a sense, that what we need to understand is the relationship between women and class society. And that relationship can only be understood if we acknowledge or we understand that the basis of women's oppression, all oppression, is class exploitation itself. The super exploitation of women as workers and their oppression as women is a fundamental prerequisite for the operation of capitalism, economically, politically, and ideologically. In this respect, the assertion that the theory of class struggle is outmoded is as nonsensical as the current non-binary claim that women are not a biological sex. The mistaken conflation between the ideological construct of gender and the biological fact of sex is absolutely inimical to Marx's analysis of women's oppression, and that's basically the central argument of this book. To understand the nature of women's oppression under capitalism, we have to begin at the level of the relations of production, with the fact that the economic with the fact of the economic exploitation of the working class by those who own means of production. And my argument is, and it needs to be spelled out much more, but just in summary, I would say that there are only two specific forms of oppression, most notably those of women and black people. And those forms of oppression serve to maximize the conditions for capitalist exploitation by dividing and weakening the working class. So the relationship between the economic base and the forms of oppression conditioned by it isn't linear or mechanical. Women in Class is concerned primarily with women, black and white women, but the key to understanding the situation of women under capitalism lies in the complex and dynamic relationship between exploitation and oppression. A full understanding of this, I think, is vital if we are to rescue the women question from interest group politics. And oppression is not the same as discrimination. I'll come on to that in a minute. Oppression is linked materially to the process of class exploitation, as well as operating at a superstructural level through oppressive ideologies which serve to maintain class rule by dividing the exploited. So what those oppressive ideologies are, of course, racism and sexism, expressed very simply, but there's much more to be said, obviously. But the material and the ideological interact. At the material level, the fact of women's oppression is responsible for the super exploitation of women at the point of production. I probably don't need to explain this, because the fact that we all know that women historically have always had low pay. The gender pay gap today is higher than just as high as it ever was, and is massive. And there's an inbuilt inequality within the labour force expressing itself through job segregation and low wage, which has reproduced itself as the normal process when workers sell their labour power. And its victims are the most easily identifiable workers. That's why I concentrate on the two oppressed groups. They're easily identifiable in terms of workers because of the colour of their skin, and women as a biological sex. And of course, it's that contradiction between their role as women in the private sphere of reproduction and their role in social production, which capitalism can exploit to its full, and thereby increasing its profits. We So women's double burden and the contradictions that they face within our lives are responsible for this. I don't think I need to say that everybody will accept that women's pay is unequal. That's why we've got legislation, which of course it doesn't work at all. So secondly, the fact of super exploitation as the central pillar of the capitalist mode of production, and the super exploitation of those who are um, uh, historically paid less than the value of their labour power. I mean, even all workers are paid less than the value of their labour power, but women people are paid even less than the value of their labour power through the operation of this divisive, oppressive ideology. And this ideology, the fact of exploitation, super exploitation, doesn't itself explain how the relations of production are maintained and reproduced. And by that I mean, how is it possible that the vast majority of people consent, in inverted commas, to be exploited by the minority? I mean, they don't consent, of course, but people are forced to sell their labour power. Why do we put up with it? Well, I think that you can only understand, that's the relations of production, i.e. the way people relate to the necessity to produce by selling their labour power. And this, I think, can only be understood, the relations of production being maintained and reproduced, by examining factors which exist outside the economic relations of production through the operation of ideologies. In particular, as I said before, racism and sexism, the chief divisive ideologies. Those are the chief non-coercive means of preventing the unity of the working class. That's the key thing. Because if the working class was united, capitalism couldn't exist. Obviously, we'd have to add into the mix class consciousness. So, therefore, the way that relations of production are reproduced is through division. And that means the perpetuation of the domination of the minority class over the majority. And just a word briefly, I hope I've got time to do this, about ideology. I think the problem is that the subjugation of women and black people has been historically connected with class society for so long that it's become the accepted natural order of things. The oppressive ideologies sustaining subservience are so culturally rooted that they pass beyond naked statements of class rule and entered into the very fabric of our lives, including language itself. As such, the ideologies of particularly sexism, but also racism, have become universalized and hence disembodied from their class origins. And in this sense, they have, as Marx would put it, fulfilled the ultimate goal of ideology, namely to represent the interest of the dominant class as the interest of society as a whole. How else can we explain the permeation of such ideas into our own movement, the labour movement, and indeed the socialist movement? So racism and sexism as material and ideological facts are central to the maintenance of capitalist and pre-capitalist class relations. That's not to put, and I wish I had more time, but that's not to put a narrow economistic interpretation on their force. They're not simply mechanisms for keeping black and women workers in a subordinate position, since as oppressive ideologies they cut across class boundaries and depend, as all ideologies do, on their universalism. So that's why there is this complex relation between all women in class society, but in particular, if we're looking at working class women who sell their labour power for a wage, there is a very direct relationship to class exploitation and oppression. So women's oppression, therefore, has a material and ideological form, is a fundamental prerequisite of class society. It's an integral function of capitalism to oppress women in order to maintain its existence by dividing the working class and by super exploiting the oppressed. Now, that's not the same as discrimination. Discrimination, of course, does exist, and we can discrimination against the elderly, discrimination against people with disabilities, discrimination to some extent against people who are transgender. But this discrimination stands in a different relation to capitalism. Discrimination, I argue, is not a function of capitalism in the same way as oppression is, but it's certainly a byproduct of an unequal and intolerant society. and such a society can choose which sector of society it will discriminate against, and it does. So, and again, there's more to be said about that, but I'll cut it short. It's discrimination is certainly a byproduct of an unequal society, and as such, it must be challenged. But the challenge to any form of discrimination should never impinge upon or impede the struggle of women to end our oppression. And that's our problem today, because the fact is that women's rights and protections fought for and won through struggles over the last 2 centuries are now facing sustained ideological attack. And this has been the result of the growth and ascendancy of neoliberal ideas and philosophy across a range of intellectual fields over the past 4 decades. And postmodern identity politics focusing on individual rights, particularly the ideology of self-identification, has seen women's collective rights threatened and in some cases undermined. The ideology behind this, and this is something that I think needs really careful consideration, again, haven't got time to do it, is to say, why is it that the dominant ideology, the ideological apparatus of the state, if you like, has embraced self-identification? And that ideology is, despite whatever non-changes in the law there might be, that ideology has penetrated deeply within our society. I'm sure others can give examples of the way that that has happened. And I mentioned a couple, the actual referral to women as cis women and the change in personal pronouns and so on. So we oppose, certainly as a Communist Party, but I think all socialist feminists should oppose this divisive form of self-identity politics, which seeks to fracture and contest socialist feminist theory and practice. And the road to socialism will be unattainable without an understanding of the link between women's oppression and class exploitation. We are half the human race after all. So the question of the status of half the human race is not a matter to be left to the political whim of the moment. It's got to be rescued from such a fate and placed where it belongs, at the forefront of the struggle, of the class struggle and the struggle for progressive change. The fundamental and most important principle underlying a Marxist analysis of the women's question, outlined, I hope, successfully in Women in Class, is that the oppression of women is rooted in class exploitation. Hence, the eradication of class exploitation is the essential precondition for the liberation of women, and socialism provides the only means by which women's liberation can truly be faced. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't start fighting right now. Thank you. Finished.
Thanks, I'm just making myself reappear. Thanks so much, Mary. Well, please, just a reminder, please do put questions in the chat for Mary and our forthcoming speakers, because there'll be plenty of time just for discussion at the end. I'm just going to now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sonya Andermahr. I'm just going to ask to start video. So Sonya is Reader in English Studies at the University of Northampton, a member of the Contemporary Women's Writing Network and an associate editor of the Oxford Journal of Contemporary Women's Writing. And Sonya will be talking to us this evening about women, class and literature. Over to you, Sonya.
Thank you very much, Marion, and thanks to Mary, who kindly invited me to give this short talk about women, class and literature. I'm delighted to be speaking alongside 2 such important figures in Marxist and socialist feminism and theory and history as Mary and Selina. So thanks for the opportunity. So on to my topic then. The first thing to say that when it comes to literature is that sex and class matter, both in the sense of who gets to write in the first place and what eventually gets published and read. While women have contributed a huge amount to literary history, most of those women have come from the upper classes. Women and men from the working class rarely had either the leisure time or the educational opportunities to produce their own writing. Throughout history, women as a sex have had a complicated access to writing as an activity, owing in part to the ideological gendered expectations of a woman's role. Aristocratic women have for centuries been permitted, and to some extent encouraged, to produce letters, poetry, and other forms seen as appropriately feminine, as part of their leisured lives. However, if they tried to stray into other genres deemed masculine, they might be publicly ridiculed or censured, as for example Margaret Cavendish, the Duchess of Newcastle, was over the publication of her work of speculative fiction, The Description of a New World called The Blazing World, published in 1666, the year after the Fire of London. Middle-class women, the wives and daughters of the burgeoning capitalist class, began to write professionally with the rapid development of print culture in the 17th century. Aphra Behn was an early pioneer, publishing her first play, The Forced Marriage, in 1670. She was famously, according to the feminist novelist and essayist Virginia Woolf, the first woman to earn her living from her pen. It was with the rise of the novel in the 18th century that women writers such as Fanny Burney and Anne Radcliffe started to make an impact in any numbers on the literary scene. Burney's novels were finely observed satires on the manners of the aristocracy, and Radcliffe pioneered the emerging genre of the Gothic romance. Both women contributed significantly to their household finances through their writing. Upon her marriage to an impoverished French exile from the French Revolution, called Alexandre D'Arblay, Burney supported the couple, and Radcliffe's earnings from her books allowed her and her husband to live well and travel. However, for working class women, access to writing has been limited, owing not only to ideological factors, but to material and practical ones. Firstly, through almost insurmountable educational barriers. A virtual lack of universal education, often basic literacy, meant that very few working class women got sufficient education to give them the skills or confidence to write. Secondly, the facts of working class women's lives, combining tiring manual labour for long hours both inside and outside the home, left scant time or energy for cultural or artistic pursuits, and meant that literary production of any kind was not a possibility for the vast majority of them. As one woman quoted by Nicola Bowman in her book on the women's novel, A Very Great Profession, said, quote, "It would have been quite impossible for any of the poor, struggling, coping women to have won the time or quiet to put pen to paper." It should be clear that the lifestyles of working women have borne little resemblance to the bourgeois Victorian ideology of women as the angel in the house. As Mary has so clearly outlined, women have suffered from super exploitation in the workplace and from oppression based on their sex in society. Historically, this has meant that they've done the lowest paid work and their wages have been lower than men's, whether they were factory workers or governesses, nursery maids or domestic servants. While their experiences in these jobs have been represented to some extent in literature, think of Anne Bronte's clear-sighted critique of the injustices meted out to Victorian governesses in her novel Agnes Grey, or Thomas Hardy's tragic depiction of the victimisation of rural working class women like Tessa the d'Urbervilles at the hands of ruling class men. In general, working class women have rarely been able to tell these stories in written form and in print themselves, which is not to say they haven't been avid storytellers in their own communities and households. Indeed, Elizabeth Roberts's oral history study of working class women testifies to the historical importance of storytelling and song in women's lives. So while educational opportunities were very limited, there have been a few important legal reforms and organisations that have contributed to working class women's education. A noteworthy one is Forster's Elementary Education Act of 1870, which made elementary education the responsibility of the state and led to a rapid rise in literacy. However, only 5% of children stayed in school after 11 years old, and this barely changed until the First World War. The majority of working class girls would have been expected to leave school to help care for younger siblings or earn a wage to support the family. The Mechanics Institutes had a very important role to play and had libraries for their workers, but these were mainly the domain of men. The Women's Cooperative Guild, established in 1883, was a very important organisation that offered women members the chance to participate in various social projects and contribute accounts of their lives and stories to its publications. The first working class woman to publish a novel in Britain is widely believed to be Ethel Kearney Holdsworth, whose evocatively titled novel Miss Nobody appeared in 1913. Born into a Lancashire weaving family in 1886, Kearney was a socialist activist who campaigned for social and economic justice and the rights of working women. She worked in the Lancashire cotton mills from the age of 11 until her early 20s. She left the mills through the patronage of the socialist author and Clarion leader Robert Blatchford to work as a journalist in London, where she edited the Woman Worker paper for a year. And she was also a teacher at the Babel House Women's College and Socialist Education Centre before returning to the north of England. With her husband, she edited The Clear Light, the organ of the National Union for Combating Fascism, which is a very important journal aimed at Socialist, Labour Party members and Communist Party members through the 20s. As well as journalism, she wrote poetry, children's stories, and at least 10 novels, making her a very rare example of a female working class novelist. Her other works include her first publication, Songs of a Factory Girl, a bit like the Chartist tradition, published in 1911, and then Helen of the Four Gates in 1917, which was her most successful book, which even was made into a silent film in 1920. And a later work, This Slavery, which had a very political theme from 1925. Her books mix popular literary styles with class conflict and present an authentic portrayal of working class women's lives as they struggle against poverty and economic hardship. In Miss Nobody, for example, the protagonist, Carrie Brown, leaves home to find work in a Manchester flax mill, where she is then boycotted for instigating a strike over pay. Kearney weaves political issues and socialist viewpoints into the text, while offering the reader an enjoyable yet thought-provoking read. In one scene, she describes Carrie's feelings for her female co-workers in terms that we would recognise as adopting a socialist feminist standpoint. Quote, some 30 girls and women worked in the long whitewashed rooms, and when they were really serious, singing some old hymn tune or a popular ditty of the day, there was a sense of brave, beautiful fellowship about them, from so many cranks in a machine into living souls. Kearney enjoyed great popularity in her day, but unfortunately she died in obscurity, and like many women writers, her books subsequently went out of print for many decades. However, thanks to the efforts by some really good socialist feminist scholars to reclaim lost working class writing, some of her titles have been reissued by small independent presses like Kennedy and Boyd and Trent in recent years. This, I think, researching and writing lives like Kearney's, which don't easily fit into academic categories, raises some important methodological issues. For example, the gatekeeping practices of the literary establishment and academy and the prevailing ideas about literariness often militate against working class writers, and especially women, being seen as worthy of publication and critical attention. Historically, aesthetic theories have been developed by the well-educated and become institutionalized over time in the academy. As a result, they frequently function to marginalize working class writers and obstruct access to literary production, publication, and dissemination. In the early 20th century, for example, just as literacy was on the rise and working class people like Kearney were being brought to writing through the spread of socialist ideas, the emergence of modernism privileged new and difficult forms which required a classical education to engage with fully over realistic ones, and recast naturalistic modes of writing which have arguably been more accessible to working class readers and writers as naive and unliterary. Despite these many obstacles to production and publication, there are now many more women writers from working class backgrounds making a living from writing, although it should be stressed that their works still form a tiny percentage of the vast number of books published every year. In Britain, they include well-known and acclaimed writers such as novelist Jeanette Winterson, Pat Barker, Ali Smith, Hilary Mantel, and Andrea Levy, poets Carol Ann Duffy and Jackie Kay, and playwrights like Sarah Daniels, Rachel Bolton, and of course Sheila Delaney, who Selina's written about in her recent book. However, despite the successes of these individual writers, there remains a dominant literary representation of class in canonical texts, which overwhelmingly accords with bourgeois ideology. This is often the case even when the writer comes from a working class background themselves. One example is Pat Barker, who was born into poverty to an unmarried mother in Thornaby-on-Tees and brought up by her grandparents. Barker got a place at grammar school and went on to the LSE, but when she started writing, she initially struggled to get published. Eventually, the feminist press Virago published her first novel, Union Street, in 1982, a brilliant, hard-hitting novel following the interlinked stories of 7 working-class women whose lives are impacted by poverty and violence. It was well received and won the Fawcett Prize. However, it was only when she stopped writing what one critic called bleak, depressing novels about women and published her World War I set Regeneration trilogy, which foregrounds the subjectivity of mainly middle-class men, military men, that she became celebrated as a universal and canonical writer. As the Marxist literary critic Lawrence Driscoll observes in his book Evading Class in Contemporary British Literature, once the depressing politics of the earlier working class novels has been abandoned, then the canon can readily celebrate Barker's work that now holds out the joyous ideological hope that resurrection and redemption, but not revolution, are possible. On the other hand, as the writer Kit Duvall points out, working class writers often feel pigeonholed, required to regurgitate their own life stories for a largely middle class audience, or squash the multiplicity of working class experience into a few standard tropes: the misery memoir, the escape, the clever girl done good. Duvall's anthology of working class writing, crowdfunded and published by Unbound, seeks to challenge the boundaries of what this category means. It's therefore important that as Marxist and feminist critics, we challenge the institutional practices which frequently canonize those writers who advance a similar, essentially bourgeois worldview and occlude the operation of class in their accounts of literature. I've focused on writers and themes rather than theories so far in this talk, but before ending, I do want to highlight that in terms of critical approaches to working class women's writing, and all writing really, Marxist feminist theory offers the most useful and relevant tools. Marxism provides a theory of capitalist class society and highlights the importance of socioeconomic and ideological influences which must be taken into account in assessing literary works. Yet as Mary's work on the subject of women and class makes evident, Marxism alone cannot answer all the questions relating to women's lives under capitalism. And for that, we also need a feminist lens to identify the specific factors bearing on the lives of women and working class women who have written or who desire to write. As Mary says in her book, the oppressive ideologies sustaining subservience are so culturally rooted that they have passed beyond naked statements of class rule and entered into the very fabric of our lives, including language itself. As such, the ideologies of both sexism and racism have become universalized and hence disembodied from their class origins. I think you actually quoted that, didn't you? One writer who continued to centre working class lives up to her very sad death last year was the Anglo-Jamaican writer Andrea Levy. Levy strove to present a realistic and life-affirming depiction of working class lives, especially Black female ones, in her books, and her death deprived British literature of one of its most vibrant and compelling voices. Through her characters, she represents the struggles for survival faced by different generations of Black people, from slavery to the Windrush generation. But she also infused her books with a strong sense of the humour and courage with which they lived their lives. Her award-winning novel Small Island, published in 2004, follows the interwoven lives of 4 characters, 2 men, 2 women, 2 Black, 2 white, in the years leading up to and after the Second World War. and is set in Jamaica and England, which both in different ways represent the small island of the title. It's a wonderful novel which challenges the view that World War II was a predominantly European war fought by white Europeans. A bit like Delaney's Taste of Honey, it also breaks new ground in depicting white and black relations based on desire, as well as competition for scarce resources. In conclusion, therefore, literature has provided an important medium for working class women like Carney, Barker and Levy to challenge oppressive sexist and other ideologies and reconnect them to their origins in class society. They've sought, in the face of an overwhelmingly bourgeois literary establishment, to depict working class lives sympathetically and authentically, often in language that respects the vernacular spoken in their communities and seeks to resist the misrepresentations in of their lives in dominant narratives. As Kit Duvall states, working class stories are not always tales of the underprivileged and dispossessed. These are narratives rich in barbed humour, their technique and vernacular reflecting the depth and texture of working class life, the joy and sorrow, the solidarity and the differences, the everyday wisdom of the woman at the bus stop, the waiter, the hairdresser. And just finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to flag up a conference I'm organising at the University of Northampton next spring, just before International Women's Day, which aims to explore working class women's writing in more detail, hopefully go into more detail about some of the writers I've touched on tonight. And I'm delighted that Selina's agreed to join us to give a plenary talk there. And I hope some of you will join us there too. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sonya. I've been just taking notes, compiling quite a reading list for myself during that. It's really, really fascinating. Right, I'll just bring our final speaker, Selina Todd, in. Right, well, I'm really delighted to welcome Selina Todd, Professor of Modern History at the University of Oxford, here this evening, author of numerous publications, including The People, The Rise and Fall of the Working Class, and Taste of Honey, The Making of Sheena Delaney, which I have to say helped me through the first couple of weeks of lockdown. It was a real pleasure to read, so I can't recommend that more. So yeah, welcome Selina, over to you.
Thanks very much indeed. Right, I'm going to try something that's very challenging for us professors, which is I'm going to try and share my screen. Let's see how this goes. Okay, so far so good. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm particularly heartened to notice that we've not lost people during the first two marvellous talks. We've actually gained participants. So if anybody leaves in the next 10 minutes or so, that's my fault, isn't it? So there's quite a pressure following those two wonderful speakers. So Mary invited me to be part of this, and I'm really pleased to be to celebrate her great book. And she asked me to talk a bit about women and class in history. For those of you who don't know, why should you? My specialism is modern British history, and so that's what I'm going to focus on in the next few minutes, talking really about where I think Mary's analysis, which I share in some ways, differ from in others, it can really help us to illuminate our understanding of the past and hopefully the present and where we might go in the future. So Mary's work, as I think she explained really eruditely this evening, has shown us how our understanding of class relations can be expanded by not only including women, but beginning with women in our analysis. And I just want to focus on one way that her work has enabled us to do this, and that some of those of us who followed her have tried to expand upon that. Focusing on women in the past illuminates that some apparently new concerns that can seem really insurmountable for people on the left are anything but new and anything but insurmountable. So at the moment, there's a lot of talk about the precarity of work, the prevalence of domestic work as an employer of women, often done by migrant workers. And these are seen as really new issues for 21st century activists, and really new issues in particular for the younger generation coming through now, affected by COVID, affected by austerity, to have to grapple with. But Until 1939, domestic servants, like those shown on the screen here, were the single largest group of workers in Britain. And the majority of them were women, and many of them were migrants from Ireland or Wales or Northern England, finding their way down to more prosperous Southeast England and London. The importance of domestic work, not just for women, but for British society at that point, also reminds us that women's reproductive capacity has meant that we are subject to a particular kind of exploitation and oppression. Women's actual and perceived role as mothers, as reproducers of labour power, or in more elite strata of property, has shaped our treatment and the ways in which our labour has been exploited. This is perhaps most obvious at the moment in women's treatment as carers, both as unpaid carers for relatives and also as low-paid carers who are expected to be satisfied with applause rather than any kind of power over their working conditions and wages. What history shows us is that's just nothing new. But Mary's focus on women's resistance reminds us that we shouldn't shrug our shoulders and simply say, well, it was ever thus. Women made history, and that's really important. I think a lot of historians don't really talk since the 1990s, really, and the kind of cultural turn, haven't really talked about how people make history. They make things change, they make things happen. And that's one of Mary's great contributions as a scholar, I think. Focusing still on servants, you know, employers coined the term the servant problem before the First World War, and it became really prevalent in the British press in the 1920s and 1930s. They meant primarily young women who disobeyed curfews that their employers imposed upon them and put more care into their appearance for visits to the local dance hall and following the latest fashions, like this advertisement here, than into their housework. They were often dismissed by social commentators at the time as dupes of the new consumer goods and of advertisements like this one. But in fact, we should understand them as fashioning a new kind of independent womanhood, asserting their right to financial and social autonomy with the few tools that they had at their disposal. And the real servant problem, the real concern for employers, was that these young women left service whenever possible, in large numbers during the First World War to go into the munitions factories, and then again in the 1930s to go onto the new assembly lines. These jobs were far from perfect. These are some factory workers in Leeds in the 1930s. But they did offer higher wages than servants received and more leisure time in which to enjoy those wages. Now, that might all seem very far removed from the kind of political change that Mary and many other Labour, working class and communist and socialist historians have focused on. But in the 1930s, young women on mass assembly lines struck for better status and higher pay and against so-called scientific techniques of measuring and paying them, which inevitably meant speeding up of the production line to unbearable rates for very little pay and effectively pay cuts. This shows two images of women workers in the 1930s. The one on the left, women working at a kind of rudimentary production line producing wirelesses. And on the right, women workers at a textile factory in Leicester who were striking against what I've just described, and in that case actually won. Like many of those disputes at the time, this began as a wildcat dispute. Trade union leaders, most of them male, believed that young women just couldn't be unionised. They were too irresponsible. And these women, it was only once they went on the picket line that they worried the local trade union, who then came in and helped them to unionise. And they did, and they did in that case win. And by 1939, it was the numbers of young women like that that helped to make the TGWU Britain's largest trade union, at a time when many male politicians and trade unionists were claiming that unskilled workers could never be organised. Now, those women went on to be among the voters who granted Labour that landslide victory win in 1945. They didn't just bring about a government who created the welfare state, they created the welfare state. There's a wonderful column in The Guardian earlier this year by Gary Young, the son of a migrant family whose mum worked within the welfare state. And he said, you know, the story that the left should be telling about Britain post-war is just how important migrants and women were to creating that welfare state. It wasn't created by Nye Bevan and Clement Attlee, important though they were. It was created by those women who had left service, gone onto the assembly lines, done war work, voted in Labour, and then became the clerks, the nurses, the teachers, and just as importantly, mothered the daughters who became the clerks, the nurses, the teachers, the technicians, who made the welfare state what it was. Many of these women, both British born and coming from overseas as migrants to make their home here and carve out a new life, a better life they hoped for themselves and for their children, became the trade unionists who ensured that by the late 1970s, British trade union density was higher than it had ever been, that the so-called gender pay gap, what's really a sex pay gap, was narrower than it had been, that women were unionised in larger numbers than they'd ever been before, and that the gap between the lowest and the highest paid was narrower than it ever has been before or since. They were responsible for that. And many of the daughters of that generation became the feminist activists of the 1970s and 80s who helped to bring about legislation on equal rights and ensure it was implemented, who introduced anti-sexist and anti-racist curricula in schools, who fought to increase nursery provision, which only began to rise in the 1970s for the first time since the 1930s, and who helped to explain why, as I've said, trade unionism became so strong. So feminism, as Mary has said, is therefore about a materialist class politics. It's not about identity politics. It's not separate from or incidental to what we think of as socialist or labourist concerns. And although feminism is often portrayed wrongly as the history of white middle-class women, many feminists came and come out of working class experience. This was a point that was made really movingly by Pragna Patel, one of the founders of Southall Black Sisters, and the daughter of an airport baggage handler and trade unionist, in a recent webinar organised by Women's Place UK. And I suggest everyone looks at their website to see some of the fantastic webinars that they're organising. So feminism as a movement for women's liberation, not just women's equality, does not and has never been based on the belief that all women have shared interests all of the time. At times, class is more important than sex. There are situations, many, in which Black women and white women's experiences have differed and differ in significant ways, just as those of heterosexual and lesbian women have done and will. It's important to recognise those differences and the important results of those different groups' ability to self-organise and to support the right to self-organise as we go forward. Nevertheless, women have organised and challenged the particular oppression that we have faced as a sex, not least by demonstrating time and again that we will not be bound by sexist gendered stereotypes that suggest that women should be defined by femininity. You know, one of the things about this edition of Mary's book is that it's full of great pictures of women doing just that. This is the cover of Mary's book. It's a female female engineering workers during the Second World War, winning a war against fascism while also fighting their way into the engineering unions. As Mary's great book shows, the history of feminism as a demand for women's equality and liberation is inextricably bound up with the history of socialism and trade unionism. Without women's activism, without feminism, we would have no welfare state. We'd have no unionisation among low-paid workers. We'd have no legal right to challenge sexism and the low-wage labour force that it's always maintained. We'd have no legal challenge to violence against women, and we'd have no women's refuges. We would not have Southall Black Sisters, Women's Place UK, or any of the other vibrant women's and feminist campaign groups that exist today, and that's just within the UK. And we would not have the ability to self-organise in order to go on fighting for our rights, hard won and always fragile, to be sustained. The world, as God, don't we all know it, is a really uncertain place at the moment. But Mary's work reminds us, and I think this is really important and such a gift that she's given us, to have hope. Whether or not you agree with all of her analysis, I think that we can find unity in agreeing that many of the women who she talks about and who I've tried to outline today, many of those women achieved victories that endure today and that are worth celebrating, as is this new edition of Mary's book. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selina, for that account of women's agency in history, which I think you're right is a really positive note to end the contributions on. I'm just going to bring everyone back in so we can have a discussion. Right, I think we should be all reassembling. Welcome back, Mary. Hi, Sonya. Right, we've got quite a few questions that have come through, so I'm just going to kind of fire away if that's okay with everybody else. Donal asks, well, he says he agrees with the reassertion of the primacy of class exploitation. I think this is specifically in reference to Mary's presentation. But he says, I think that the argument is taken too far, claiming that there are only two forms of oppression. Lenin wrote extensively on national oppression, indeed made opposing it a prerequisite for affiliation to the Third International. There are other oppressions, and these are not simply economic in form. Do you want to come back on that at all, Mary? Or should we go through a few and then...
Yeah.
Actually, there's a related one, which Ruth Stiles put forward, just asking, which I think would be really quite helpful to start with probably, about the difference between oppression and exploitation. So no, oppression and discrimination, yeah. Which, Mary, I know you touched upon, but I think that would be quite nice to start out with.
Oh, what, me now, you mean?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, I obviously didn't explain myself very well. When I talked about two forms of oppression, I'm talking about those elements which are absolutely integral to the maintenance of class society, of all forms of class society, actually. And I particularly singled out, when I said, because they lead to A, capitalist super profits through super exploitation, and B, they enable the relations of production to reproduce because they divide workers. So those, they're absolutely, I would say, integral. I mean, there are all sorts of ideological forms like religion, nationalism, and so on, which may be brought into play, but they're not. These are legal and juridical forms. These forms of oppression, based on most easily identifiable characteristics, people's biological sex and colour of their skin, but obviously the latter underpins slavery. I don't want to talk too much about racism because the subject is women and class. But in terms of women's oppression, I didn't go into Engels, although we have got the Engels Memorial Lecture coming up soon. But Engels identifies women's oppression as being really coming about as soon as society could produce a surplus, and that the monogamous nuclear family witnessed the defeat of the entire of the female sex. But that's for another time. So now, if I'm right in saying that oppression is a key tool in enabling class society to function by promoting divisions and yielding profits for those who own or control the means of production at any particular point in class history, I think you can see that is rather different from discrimination. Discrimination does certainly exist, and different forms of discrimination exist at different times. The constants are the oppression of women throughout. So if you say, let's say, well, it's all bound up actually with this, what I consider an incorrect notion of intersectionality. And it's probably not right for me to go into that now because I'm sure there are other questions and it's a huge other subject. But if we see class as is the foundation, the class struggle is the foundation of all forms of class society, then I think we have to analyse what it is that enables that to stick together. And it's not discrimination. Just people are discriminated against because they've got an ability or disability, that they're not handsome or pretty, they're not tall or short. It depends on the mores of the times, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of people who will say, well, you know, the new form of oppression is that which is meted out against transgender people. And I would say that's not oppression. But anyway, I think I better stop, because I'm sure other people want to come in and there are other questions. And this is getting into an area of major discussion now, which we could have another session on, actually.
I've muted myself. Would anyone else like to come in on this question?
Well, I was trying to apply it to the literary scene, and I was just thinking about the obstacles to women and relating them to women's sex-based oppression. And I think the key thing is, you know, the burden of childcare, birthing children, caring for children, and that obviously takes away from any time spent writing, thinking, in cultural activity. And I was just looking up the quote from Cyril Connolly about the pram in the hall being the enemy of good writing. And I think that's something actually that lots of us have experienced during lockdown, while we're sort of doing childcare and homeschooling and Zoom meetings and all the rest of it. And it has actually had a material impact on women's productivity and ability to do their work, and amongst academic women as well, apparently, whereas men's research has gone up during lockdown, women's has gone down, and that is linked to our material situations. Yeah.
Thanks,
so.
Sonya. Actually, Sonya, I've got a very quick follow-up question for you. We've had two people actually ask for the name of the author you're referring to, who wrote on Factory Girls.
Oh yes, I did reply to Ruth, but it's Ethel Carney Holdsworth.
Right, okay, I hope everyone's
So
made a note
if you
of
look
that.
up Ethel Carney, and yes, some of her books have just recently been republished. There's Helen of the Four Gates, and I really recommend her. And then the more contemporary writers, Andrea Levy, Levy, who died last year, and also Pat Barker, the Regeneration trilogy writer. I think those are the three main ones. There were some earlier ones: Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, Fanny Burney, and Anne Radcliffe, the Gothic romancer.
Thank
Do you want me to stick them in the chat?
That would be really helpful, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Thanks. Selina, did you want to come back on this question of oppression and discrimination? Or we're fine.
That's
okay.
fine.
No. Okay. I've got quite a few questions that are coming in now. So, somebody else raises the thesis in Anna Clark's Struggle for the Breaches on unionisation of the workforce in the 19th century, which involved the breadwinner wage and the lower position of married women. And they ask, do we need to revisit this thesis at the moment?
Shall I say something quickly?
It looks like you want to, yeah.
The whole myth of the family wage is of course a myth. It's actually what the benefit system was based on when it was brought in, the Beveridge report. This notion that, and it justifies unequal pay, because it's not even a theory, it's just a bit of stupidity, that somehow or other men get higher pay than women because they are the male breadwinner, and their wage reflects the fact that they the wife and they've got a wife and dependent children. And of course it's a fiction, because not everybody lives in the nuclear family anyway, and there are lots of women who are the breadwinners. So it's a wonderful ideological stupidity and a device invented by the Victorians, and bolstered actually by unfortunately the new model unions. Henry Broadhurst, who was the General Secretary of the TUC, wanted married women not to work. It justified the marriage part. He said that women should be in their proper place at home and not be brought into competition with the great and strong men of the world. Well, you know, you can see how that utterly sexist patriarchal notion just absolutely just help to bolster the system. So the family wages are nonsense, but it's an ideological fiction which has absolutely penetrated deep into ruling class ideology and still operates.
Selina, did you want to come back on this? Yeah.
Yeah, if that's all right. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. One of the effects that the historian Anna Clark's work had was to suggest that trade unionism and indeed socialism in the 19th century had really posited women as second-class citizens in the way that Mary's just so clearly described. And while that was largely true, I think what that's meant is that then historians have to some extent ignored those bits of the movement that didn't treat women like that, and also to some extent ignored the importance of women's self-organisation within movements like the Chartists, within the trade union movement, within the Independent Labour Party, and so on, and the way that then that fed into feminist movement. So that idea of the male breadwinner was there and really did need and still does need to be challenged. But I think that there's a wider history there that we need to reclaim, not least to present the history of feminism, as I said, of being written off really as a kind of history of a white middle class elite, when it was never like that. It was always a much broader church. I think the other thing that where the idea of the male breadwinner as predominant has really been harmful is, as I said, domestic workers were the largest single group of workers in Britain before 1939, and that's just been overlooked because we've always had this idea that men were the major breadwinners. The other thing that it brings us to is the way that the state deals with people as communities and as units. So after the Second World War, as Mary said, the welfare state was based on the idea that people lived in nuclear families. It's perfectly understandable that states need to think about how they treat people as units, because people don't just live as individuals, we do live as communities. We're seeing that now with all the battles about how do we deal with COVID, and at what level, the nation, the neighbourhood, the individual, do we make people responsible and bring in policies and so on. But I think one of the things that feminists have really shown is that we need to attend very critically and very precisely to who we mean when we talk about a community. And just going back to, say, Southall Black Sisters and some of the amazing work that they've done, one of the things that they've really done is to puncture this idea of faith communities by saying, can we just attend to who gets to speak there and who is called a leader, not an elected leader? And it's very often men who are speaking in favour of the oppression of women and in favour of policies and faith-based regulation of women's liberty.
Thank you very much, Selina. So I've got another one from Olivia, who says, I like Selina's assertion that we should be hopeful and that there is progress, but it does feel like throughout history we're dealing with the same issues of the working class being divided, white working class people feeling threatened by black rights movements or women's rights movements because there isn't a recognition that we're all being exploited by the same people. So I think there's two prongs to this. Have we made any progress with this, and how do we talk about this today? Sorry, it's quite a big question.
That was great.
Who wants to start?
Shall I start,
Yeah,
and then
thanks.
others can come in? I think it's a brilliant question because it goes to the heart of so much of what I think concerns many of us in looking at the present and the future. I am hopeful, and I think progress really has been made. If we think about the fact that for all the problems, and my God, there are problems, and there's exploitation, and there's oppression, and virulent racism, and homophobia, but it is the fact now that there are legal protections that weren't there 20, 30, 40 years ago because of activists. Grassroots activists brought these kinds of things about. It is the case that people cannot put up signs saying no Irish, no blacks when they're letting a room. And that is some sort of progress, and it's progress which movements and activists and grassroots action brought about. So I think that there has been progress. I also think that, you know, there's a kind of sense that that somehow we need a movement which is really unified all the time, and in which everybody's interests are either the same, or the shared interests, you know, are always there at the front. I kind of don't think that's ever happened. I think there are always tensions. And, you know, I mentioned in my talk the importance of allowing different groups to self-organize. And that's really important, because rather than seeing oppression as a hierarchy, you know, oh, I'm more oppressed than you because, you know, I've got these kinds of oppressions and so on. What we need to do is to recognize shared interests, but also recognize different experiences, and make it possible for groups within our movement to self-organize, and then see what happens and see where those common points of interest are. And, you know, one dispute, which, you know, for a historian is very recent, is, you know, if we think about the Grunwick dispute of the mid-1970s, where a group of largely Asian women working at a film processing plant came together to demand unionisation, to demand more power over negotiating their working rights, and were then joined on the picket line by male trade unionists, by white women, in a dispute that became so incredibly threatening that both the Labour and the Conservative parties began to think it would be a good idea to send the army in to break it up. You know, it's the longest, really long-running industrial dispute. So I think that we can see places where unity can be made, but we do need to recognise that your self-organisation has to be part of that, and that there'll always be tension, there'll always be debate, and that's why freedom of speech, freedom to debate, and democracy has to be central to everything that we do. So I think that's something that we should be fighting for now. And in terms of, I saw that the second part of the question is, you know, how do people without education, you know, get to know about this? I don't really think that we need to worry about that too much, because our movement, you know, was founded by many people who didn't have access to education. And in fact, one of the first demands of the trade union movement in Britain, when it set itself up in the mid-19th century, was for free universal state education, and they got it. The longest running arm of the adult education movement in this country is the Workers' Educational Association, which was established by labour movement activists in the early 20th century. And if there's one fight that I think we could all unite around, it's for a more imaginative and universal form of adult education than the one that Boris Johnson has just posited today.
Yes, I completely identify with what Sonya, as Selina's just said about the Grunwick dispute. I bear the scars of that. I was in a wheelchair for months afterwards, actually, and it's absolutely right. Those points in history where we do see that kind of unity is absolutely vital. But we don't. It's a slogan on all our banners: unity is strength. But you can only have unity by recognising difference. And those differences, of course, are there, but they can be united in a common goal. And actually, that's what history shows, isn't it? That all of the gains that we've made, and some of them obviously they want to take away from us, but they've all been won through struggle, and that struggle has had to be very, very strong at times, and it's often been a united struggle on particular issues. It's not, you know, although I say our goal is socialism, that's not to say that we can't win reforms within the system. We have to, because people learn through struggle. People learn through being active trade unionists, through being on strike, through all that solidarity. I think what we desperately need, apart from a stronger trade union movement, which actually under COVID we are seeing signs of that growing and developing, which is fantastic. But what I think we desperately need is a socialist feminist women's movement. And I say a socialist feminist women's movement because I think that's where we're at. I think that's what is possible. I don't want to impose a political stamp on a broad movement, but I think that the struggles that women have been through at the moment in trying to re-identify and come together, because we have been faced with a lot of opposition organising as women. I mean, we have to all recognise that. And the fact that almost every certain political party, especially the Labour Party, seems to think that Women's Place UK is a hate group, and you know that this kind of thing we have to fight against it. And it's bringing women together. I think that's what we vitally need. We need a strong women's movement which has got links with the labour movement. That's not it's separate but linked, so that all those gains, and I would add to the gains that we did make when we had a strong women's movement. That's when we got women's courses. That's when we had more women standing for election. We had a campaign for having women's self-organisation within the trade union movement, women's conferences, women's collectives, and that really pushed the boundaries of what trade unions had stood for when they were just white male organisations. So self-organisation was vital to get an anti-racist movement going and to get a women's movement within the trade union movement. And we actually have lost some of that. In kind of a generic equalities thing, women have lost out. We are half the workforce. We are half the trade union movement. So I think we do need to bridge those gaps and to recognise that nothing that we've got has been given to us. We've won it through our organised strength, and that's what we need more and more.
Thank you, Mary. Sonia, did you want to comment on this at all?
Yeah, I mean, I was going to say some of what Mary and Selina just said, and I just sort of reiterate their thoughts. I mean, it does seem overwhelming sometimes, doesn't it? The you know, the force of neoliberalism and global capitalism sometimes seems insurmountable, and yeah, postmodern identity politics has created new fractures and fragmented the left, and there's no doubt about that. We've just had the disappointment of Corbyn losing the 2019 election, so that's thrown the left in Britain back. So I mean, there's an awful lot to struggle with and deal with, isn't there? But I think, yeah, there are some signs of hope. Again, like Mary, I think there are some signs of a resurgent women's movement. The Black Lives Matter movement as well has shown, you know, can bring people out on the streets to challenge racism. And we've seen workers pushing back against corporate exploitation and interests, and the emergence of new, smaller unions. So, you know, it's about bringing those struggles together, isn't it? Recognising that there are, Mary said, differences, but there are huge commonalities. And I think I'll just, yeah, before I finish, just relate it back again to the work of Andrea Levy, who, although she was focusing on Black people's lives and history, she always brought it back to class. She always showed how there were common struggles between Black and white people in the British context or wherever. And she shows great humanity, really, in her work, that those, you know, that people can come together and they can challenge their oppression and exploitation. Thanks.
Thank you, Sonia. I just realised how quickly the time has whizzed by
Yeah,
during our discussion. It's 25 past 8. So while there's lots of other questions in the chat, but I feel like we should probably, there are people kind of gradually slipping away, we should probably wrap up. And also it's a relatively positive note, I think, to end on. We've been talking about the future and where we go next. Just want to say an absolutely massive thank you to all our panellists. I think it's been a wonderful event. We've recorded it, so we can put this up on our website shortly. I know Mary's already mentioned part 2, but obviously what we do want to be doing at the Marks Memorial Library is having this discussion, revisiting these issues, and also, like Selina's been pointing out, kind of recognising women's agency in history and in our movement as an integrated part of what we do all the time, really, and not have a kind of specific women's panel occasionally. So thank you all, and thank you everyone for logging in, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.
Are you still,
Mary, do you want a final say?
No,
I think you should. Go on. Go.
Can we go to the pub now?
Oh no, unfortunately
wouldn't
not.
that be nice? Yes, please.
But obviously the key message is buy the book. You've seen the link in the chat a few times. Do get hold of it. And people are waving their copies. I've got mine here as well. There you go. All got our copies. Thanks all. Are you saying something, Mary? All right. Thanks all. Bye.
All right. Thank you very much. Thanks for coming, everybody. Good night. Bye.